The woman stood on the auction block, invisible to everyone but the dust. Eleanor Graves was 55 years old, and today in a barn reeking of tobacco and contempt, she would learn exactly what the world thought she was worth. The answer came in jeers, in silence, in the way grown men looked through her like she was already a ghost. But when the bidding stalled and humiliation turned to something darker, a stranger's voice cut through the crowd, low, deliberate, dangerous. What he did next would shatter everything she thought she knew about survival, dignity, and the brutal possibility of starting over when life has already buried you alive. If you want to see how Eleanor's story unfolds, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The barn smelled like old hay, spilled whiskey, and the particular sourness of men who'd stopped caring what they looked like to God or anyone else. Eleanor Graves stood on a wooden platform that had been built for livestock, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to keep them still. The rope around her wrists wasn't tight. Whoever had tied it hadn't bothered with precision, as if even restraint wasn't worth the effort for someone like her. She was 55 years old. In another life, that would have meant wisdom, respect, grandchildren gathered around a Sunday table. In this life, in this year of 1883, in this godforsaken corner of Wyoming territory, it meant she was used up. Worthless. A burden no one wanted to shoulder. The auctioneer was a short man with a voice that didn't match his stature, booming, theatrical, designed to whip a crowd into a buying frenzy. He'd done well with the younger women. Eleanor had watched from the shadows as 3 girls, none older than 25, had been claimed by men who'd bid with the casual confidence of people purchasing farm equipment. The girls had cried. The men had laughed. The transaction had been efficient. Now it was Eleanor's turn, and the auctioneer's enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. "Gentlemen," his voice cracked through the barn like a whip, but there was a forced quality to it now. "We have here Mrs. Eleanor Graves, widow, experienced in household management, cooking, sewing, and all manner of domestic labor." "She looks half dead already," someone called from the back. Laughter rippled through the crowd like a disease. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden beam across from her. She'd learned over the past 3 years since Thomas died that the worst moments passed faster if you didn't fight them. If you just disappeared into yourself and waited for the world to finish with you. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Now, I'll grant you she's got some years on her, but that means experience, gentlemen. This is a woman who knows her way around a homestead. She's not going to give you trouble or need constant supervision like these younger ones." "I got a mule that's more useful," another voice shouted. More laughter. Eleanor's jaw tightened. The knot in the beam had 7 distinct whorls. She counted them again. 7. Always 7. "Let's start the bidding at $20, the auctioneer said, and even he sounded doubtful. Silence. $20 was nothing. A good horse went for $75. A decent milk cow for $40. $20 was what you paid for a broken plow you planned to fix yourself. The silence stretched. Eleanor could feel the weight of it, heavy as wet canvas. She'd known it would be like this. When the debt collectors had come for Thomas's land, when they'd itemized everything she owned down to the chipped dishes and worn quilts, when they'd given her the choice between debtor's prison or the auction block, she'd known. A woman her age, with no children, no property, no youth to recommend her, she was the bottom of the barrel. $15, the auctioneer amended, desperation creeping into his voice. "Surely someone can see the value in—" "I'll give you $5, a gravelly voice called out, and the laughter that followed was different this time. Meaner, because they all knew what a $5 bid meant. Eleanor's eyes finally moved from the beam. She couldn't help it. The man who'd spoken was standing near the front, arms crossed, a smile on his face that made her skin crawl. She recognized the type, the kind of man who bought broken things because he enjoyed breaking them further. "Now, Mr. Pritchard," the auctioneer said, trying to maintain some semblance of decorum, "I think we can do better than—" $5 is generous for that one," Pritchard said, his voice carrying easily through the barn. "Look at her. She'll be dead in a year, maybe less. I'll work her through the winter, get my money's worth, and bury her come spring. $5 is fair." The casual certainty with which he discussed her death, as if it were already a settled matter, a transaction already completed, struck Eleanor harder than any of the earlier mockery. Her hands weren't just trembling now, they were shaking badly enough that the rope bit into her wrists. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them all what she thought of them. These men who'd built their lives on the backs of women and then discarded those women like trash when they'd extracted every useful year. She wanted to tell Pritchard specifically that she'd survive him out of pure spite, if nothing else. But she didn't, because what was the point? They'd already decided what she was worth, and screaming wouldn't change the number. $5, the auctioneer repeated weakly. Going once. Eleanor closed her eyes. Thomas had been dead 3 years, but in that moment she missed him with a ferocity that nearly buckled her knees. Not because he'd been perfect, he hadn't been. Not because their marriage had been some great love story. It had been practical, built on mutual need more than passion. But because he'd been hers, because he'd seen her as human, because when she'd woken up next to him each morning, she'd been Eleanor, not just a collection of tasks that needed doing. Going twice, she thought about her daughter, Mary, who died of fever at age 7. 28 years gone, but Eleanor could still remember the exact weight of that small body in her arms, the way Mary's hair had smelled like sunshine and grass. If there was anything after this, any kind of mercy in the universe, maybe she'd see Mary again soon. Maybe Pritchard was right, and she'd be dead by spring. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt almost like relief. Sold to $10. The voice came from the back of the barn, so quiet that Eleanor almost thought she'd imagined it. But the auctioneer had heard it too, his head snapping toward the source with obvious surprise. I'm sorry, did someone... I said $10. The voice was clearer now, still quiet, but carrying an edge of steel that cut through the ambient noise. For the woman. The crowd shifted, men turning to see who'd spoken. Eleanor opened her eyes, straining to see past the bodies and the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that cut through the barn's walls. A man stepped forward, tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor and a face that was difficult to read in the barn's dim interior. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim, a simple cotton shirt, scuffed boots that had seen 1,000 miles of trail. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his features. $10, the auctioneer repeated, and Eleanor could hear the relief in his voice. $10 was still insulting, but it was double Pritchard's offer. It was something. Do I hear 15? Pritchard was staring at the newcomer with undisguised hostility. Who the hell are you? The cowboy didn't answer. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, waiting. That's Mason Hale, someone in the crowd muttered. Keeps to himself up in the high country. Ain't seen him in town for near a year. $15, Pritchard said, his eyes still locked on Mason. And I'll thank you to mind your own business, Hale. Mason's expression didn't change. 20. A murmur ran through the crowd. $20. The original asking price. For a woman Pritchard had just valued at 5. Pritchard's face was reddening. You got some particular interest in worn-out widows, Hale? 25, Mason said, as if Pritchard hadn't spoken. The murmur grew louder. This wasn't how these things usually went. Men bid against each other for the young ones, the pretty ones, but not for women like Eleanor. Not for the ones everyone had already written off. This is ridiculous, Pritchard snarled. She ain't worth $25. She ain't worth 10. I was doing charity offering 5. 30, Mason said. Eleanor's breath caught. $30. That was real money. That was what you paid for something you actually wanted, not something you were settling for. The auctioneer was grinning now, sensing an actual competition. $30 from Mr. Hale. Do I hear 35? Pritchard's hands had curled into fists. What the hell do you want with her? Mason finally looked directly at Pritchard, and even from across the barn, Eleanor could feel the temperature drop. $30, he repeated. Going to bid, or are we done here? The silence that followed was different from before. Before it had been contemptuous. Now it was tense, expectant. 2 men locked in a contest of wills, and Eleanor, forgotten, invisible Eleanor, was somehow the prize. 35, Pritchard spat. 40, Mason replied without hesitation. 45. 50. The crowd was fully engaged now, men calling out encouragement and jokes, treating it like a horse race. Eleanor felt dizzy. $50. That was more than she'd ever been worth, even when she was young, even when Thomas had married her and her family had provided a modest dowry. Pritchard was breathing hard, his face nearly purple. "You're out of your mind, Hale." $50, the auctioneer called. "Going once, going twice? Fine," Pritchard shouted. "Take the useless old bitch. Hope she dies before you get her home." He turned and shoved his way through the crowd, knocking into men who scattered to let him pass. The barn filled with laughter and commentary, but Eleanor barely heard it. She was staring at the tall cowboy who'd just paid $50, for a woman he'd never met. "Sold to Mr. Mason Hale for $50, the auctioneer declared triumphantly. "Sir, if you'll settle up here at the table—" Mason moved through the crowd with an economy of motion that suggested he was used to people getting out of his way. Up close, Eleanor could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 40, certainly no more than 45. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, lined around the eyes and mouth, but there was something solid about him, steady. He didn't look at her as he counted out bills onto the auctioneer's table, didn't smile or smirk or show any emotion at all. Just completed the transaction with the same flat efficiency he might use buying supplies at a general store. The auctioneer handed him a piece of paper, the receipt, the proof of ownership, and Mason folded it without looking at it, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Then finally, he turned to Eleanor. She'd expected, she didn't know what. Triumph, maybe. Or possessiveness. Or that particular gleam that men like Pritchard got when they looked at something they owned. But Mason's eyes held none of that. They were gray, she noticed. Storm cloud gray. And they looked at her the way you might look at another person, not a piece of property. He stepped up onto the platform. Eleanor's heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. He was close enough now that she could smell him, leather and horse and wood smoke, clean smells, working smells. "Ma'am," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. Then he did something that stopped her heart entirely. He dropped to one knee in front of her. The barn went silent. Men stopped their conversations mid-sentence. Even the auctioneer froze, uncertain what was happening. Mason reached for the rope around Eleanor's wrists, and she flinched without meaning to. He paused, his hands hovering near hers. "I'm going to untie you now," he said, and it wasn't a statement or a command. It was somehow a question, asking permission. Eleanor couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. She managed a tiny nod. His fingers were deft with the knots, gentler than whoever had tied them. The rope fell away, and Eleanor's hands dropped to her sides, blood rushing back into her wrists with a painful tingle. Mason stood, but he didn't move away. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her want to step back, except there was nowhere to go. "My name is Mason Hale," he said, loud enough for the barn to hear. "I own a cabin about 15 miles north of here, up in the hill country. I paid for you today, which according to the law means you belong to me." Eleanor's brief, impossible hope guttered and died. Of course that was what this was. He just wanted to establish dominance over Pritchard, or maybe, "But I don't believe one person can own another," Mason continued, and the barn erupted in scandalized muttering. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk out of here now. You got two choices." He pulled the receipt from his pocket, the paper that proved his legal claim to her, and held it where she could see it. Then, with slow deliberation, he tore it in half, and then in half again. The pieces fluttered to the platform floor like snow. "You can walk away," Mason said. "Right now. I won't stop you. Far as I'm concerned, you don't owe me anything, and you're free to go wherever you please." Eleanor stared at him. This had to be a trick. A cruel game. Men didn't pay $50 for something and then just let it go. "Or," Mason said, "you can come with me. I got a cabin that needs keeping, and I could use help running it. I'll provide room and board, and you'll have your own space. No debt, no obligation. You want to leave after a day or a week or a year, you leave. Your choice." The muttering in the barn had grown to outright shouting. Men were calling Mason a fool, an idiot, saying he'd lost his mind. Someone yelled that this was against the law, that the transaction was binding, that you couldn't just free someone you'd bought. Mason ignored all of it. His eyes stayed on Eleanor. "What's it going to be, ma'am?" Eleanor's mind was racing, trying to find the angle, the trap, the hidden cruelty. But she was also doing rapid calculations. If she walked away, where? She had no money, no friends, no family. Winter was coming. She'd be dead in a ditch within a week, or she'd end up right back here, on this platform, and next time maybe Pritchard would be the only one bidding. If she went with Mason, well, maybe it was a trap. Maybe he was lying, and the moment they were alone he'd show his true colors. But at least it was a gamble. At least it was a chance. And there was something in his eyes, something that reminded her just faintly of Thomas on their wedding day, nervous and honest and trying his best to do right. "I'll come with you," Eleanor heard herself say. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and fear, but it was steady. "For now." Mason nodded once. "Fair enough." He gestured toward the barn entrance. "After you." Eleanor stepped down from the platform on shaking legs. The crowd parted around her, men staring like she was some kind of oddity. She could hear them talking, speculating about what Mason Hale was really planning, what he really wanted with a used-up widow. She walked through them with her head up, trying to reclaim some scrap of dignity. Mason fell into step slightly behind her, a solid presence at her back. They emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight, and Eleanor had to blink against the glare. The town of Redemption, if you could call it a town, more like a collection of ramshackle buildings that had sprouted up around a railroad depot, stretched out before her. Muddy streets, false front stores, the constant sound of hammers and saws as people tried to build something permanent out of nothing. Mason walked past her to where a horse was tethered, a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes. He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then offered Eleanor his hand. She hesitated. She hadn't ridden a horse in years, hadn't sat this close to a man who wasn't Thomas in even longer. "I won't let you fall," Mason said quietly. Eleanor took his hand. His grip was strong, calloused, warm. He pulled her up behind him with no apparent effort, and she had to grab his waist to keep from sliding off. "Hold tight," he said. "It's a long ride." He urged the horse into a walk, and Redemption began to fall away behind them. Eleanor looked back once, at the barn where she'd been sold like cattle, at the town where she'd lost everything. Then she turned forward, resting her cheek against Mason Hale's broad back, and tried not to think about what came next. The ride took them out of what passed for civilization and into country that grew wilder with each mile. The road, barely more than a trail, wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing gradually into the foothills. The air grew cooler, thinner. Eleanor could smell sage and pine resin, could hear the distant call of a hawk. Mason didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it wasn't. It was just quiet, peaceful almost. After the noise and chaos of the auction barn, after weeks of debt collectors shouting and lawyers droning and creditors making threats, the silence felt like a gift. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when Mason finally spoke. "You hungry?" Eleanor realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, a piece of stale bread one of the other women at the boarding house had shared. "Yes," she admitted. Mason nodded. "We'll stop soon. Cabin's still a few hours off, and I don't fancy riding these trails in the dark." True to his word, he guided the horse off the trail about 15 minutes later into a small clearing near a creek. He dismounted first, then helped Eleanor down. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled slightly. His hand shot out to steady her. "You all right?" "Fine," Eleanor said quickly, stepping back. It's been a while since I rode." Mason nodded. He didn't press. He just went about making camp with the efficient motions of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Eleanor watched, uncertain what she was supposed to do. "Help? Stay out of the way?" "There's a creek just through those trees," Mason said without looking at her. "If you want to wash up." Eleanor glanced toward the trees, then back at Mason. He was building a fire, his attention apparently fully focused on the task. "Go on," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She went. The creek was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. Eleanor knelt beside it and splashed water on her face, her neck, her hands. The shock of the cold helped clear her head, helped her think. She was alone in the wilderness with a strange man. A man who'd bought her and then claimed he didn't believe in ownership, who'd torn up his receipt and offered her freedom. Either he was the most decent man she'd ever met, or he was playing a long game she didn't understand yet. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the water. The woman looking back at her was old, no point denying it. Gray streaked her dark hair, lines carved deep around her eyes and mouth. She looked tired, used up, exactly what Pritchard had called her. But she wasn't dead yet. Eleanor cupped water in her hands and drank deeply, letting the cold spread through her chest. Then she stood, smoothed her dress as best she could, and walked back to the clearing. Mason had the fire going. He was pulling supplies from his saddlebags, jerky, hardtack, a small sack of coffee. He looked up when she approached. "Not much, but it'll hold us till tomorrow," he said. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. The jerky was tough but flavorful, the coffee strong and bitter. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time anything had tasted so good. When they finished, Mason pulled a bedroll from his saddle. "You take this," he said, holding it out to her. "I'll keep the fire going." Eleanor stared at the bedroll. "What about you?" "I'm fine." "You can't sit up all night." "Done it plenty of times before," Mason said. His tone wasn't sharp, just matter of fact. "You need rest more than I do. Take it." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was so tired her bones ached. She took the bedroll and spread it near the fire, far enough from Mason to feel safe, but close enough to feel the warmth. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The stars were coming out overhead, more than she'd ever seen in town. Thousands of them, scattered across the sky like someone had flung handfuls of diamonds against black velvet. "Mr. Hale?" she said into the darkness. "Mason's fine." "Mason, then? Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Silence. For so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Had a mother once. Good woman. Worked herself to death trying to keep food on the table after my father left. I was 14 when she passed. Buried her in a pauper's grave because I didn't have money for anything better." Eleanor turned her head to look at him. He was staring into the fire, his face unreadable. "When I saw you on that platform," Mason continued, "saw the way they were treating you, talking about you like you were garbage, I thought about her. Thought about what it would have been like if she'd ended up somewhere like that." He paused. "Couldn't walk away." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm not your mother. I know that. And I can't replace her." "I know that too." Mason finally looked at her. "I'm not expecting anything from you, ma'am. Just offering what I can, that's all." Eleanor wanted to believe him. Part of her, a small, desperate part, already did. But the rest of her, the part that had been disappointed and hurt too many times, held back. "Get some sleep," Mason said gently. "Long day tomorrow." Eleanor closed her eyes. Sleep should have been impossible. She was in the middle of nowhere with a strange man. Her entire life had just been upended again, and she had no idea what the future held. But the fire was warm, the bedroll was soft, and for the first time in months, she wasn't actively afraid. She slept. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a horse snorting softly. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The auction, Mason, the ride into the wilderness. She sat up quickly, her body protesting. Mason was already awake, dressed, the fire rebuilt, and a pot of coffee warming on the stones at its edge. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's ready when you are." Eleanor stood, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground. She must have looked as uncomfortable as she felt, because Mason added, "Cabin's got a real bed. You'll do better tonight." They broke camp efficiently, or rather, Mason did, while Eleanor tried to stay out of the way. Within 30 minutes, they were back on the horse, climbing higher into the hills. The landscape changed as they climbed. The pine trees grew thicker, taller. Eleanor caught glimpses of elk moving through the shadows, heard the distant burble of streams cutting through stone. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed. They stopped once at midday to water the horse and eat the last of the jerky. Mason pointed out landmarks as they rode, a distinctive rock formation that meant they were halfway there, a particular lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of his land. "You own all this?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Mason shrugged. "Got a claim on about 160 acres. Most of it's too steep to farm, too rough for cattle. But there's good hunting, plenty of water. I run some trap lines in winter, do some logging when I need cash. It's enough." "Don't you get lonely?" The words were out before Eleanor could stop them. Mason didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he finally said. "But there's different kinds of lonely. I'd rather be alone by choice than surrounded by people who make me feel alone anyway." Eleanor understood that more than she wanted to admit. The sun was starting its downward slide when they finally crested a ridge, and Mason said, "There." Eleanor looked where he was pointing and saw, nestled in a small valley below, a cabin. It was bigger than she'd expected. Not just a one-room shack, but a solid structure with a front porch, a stone chimney, several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, which surprised her until she saw a figure moving near the woodshed. "That's Jonah," Mason said. "My nephew. He's been keeping an eye on the place." They rode down into the valley, and the figure, a boy of maybe 12 or 13, stopped what he was doing and stared. Mason raised a hand in greeting. "Uncle Mason." The boy's voice cracked on the words, still caught in the uncertain territory between childhood and adolescence. "You're back early. I wasn't expecting—" He stopped, noticing Eleanor. "Oh." Mason dismounted and helped Eleanor down. "Jonah, this is Mrs. Graves. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Mrs. Graves, this is my nephew, Jonah Hale." The boy was staring at Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. He had Mason's gray eyes, though his were wider, less guarded. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." "Eleanor is fine," she said. The formality of Mrs. Graves felt like a suit of clothes that no longer fit. Mason was already moving toward the cabin. "I'll show you your room. Jonah, see to the horse?" "Yes, sir." Eleanor followed Mason up the porch steps and through the front door. The interior of the cabin was dim after the bright sunlight, but as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the details. A main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with benches, shelves lined with supplies and tools. Doorways led to what must be other rooms. "Kitchen's through there," Mason said, pointing. "Storage room beyond that. 2 bedrooms this way." He led her down a short hallway. The first door was open, revealing a small room with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand. Simple but clean. This was going to be Jonah's room, but he likes sleeping in the loft, Mason said. "It's yours now if you want it." Eleanor stepped inside. The bed had actual sheets, a quilt that looked handmade. There was a window with real glass, expensive this far from town, that looked out over the valley. A rag rug on the floor, a lamp on the dresser. It was more than she'd had in months, maybe more than she'd ever had. "There's water in the pitcher," Mason said from the doorway. "Outhouse is behind the cabin. If you need anything else, just ask." Eleanor turned to face him. He was silhouetted against the light from the main room, his expression invisible. "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question came out harder than she'd intended, almost accusatory. Mason was quiet for a long moment. "My mother used to say that kindness doesn't need a reason. That if you're only kind when you've got a good reason, you're not really kind at all." He shifted his weight. "I'll let you settle in. Supper will be ready in about an hour." He left, pulling the door partway closed behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the small room, her room, and felt something crack open in her chest. It might have been grief. It might have been hope. She wasn't sure she knew the difference anymore. She sat down on the bed. The mattress was filled with straw, but it was clean and soft. And for the first time since Thomas died, Eleanor Graves put her face in her hands and cried. Not from sadness, exactly. Not from relief, either. Just from the overwhelming strangeness of being here, in this place, with these people, when 12 hours ago she'd been standing on an auction platform preparing to die. She cried quietly, not wanting Mason or Jonah to hear. When the tears finally stopped, she washed her face in the basin, smoothed her dress, and tried to make herself presentable. Then she opened the door and stepped out to face whatever came next. The main room smelled like wood smoke and something cooking, beans, maybe, and cornbread. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her bedroom, watching Mason move around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been cooking for himself for a long time. Jonah sat at the table, whittling something from a piece of pine, the shavings falling in pale curls to the floor. Neither of them had noticed her yet. For a moment, Eleanor considered retreating back to her room, hiding until she could compose herself better. But that was cowardice, and she'd been through too much to start being a coward now. She stepped into the main room. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and both Mason and Jonah looked up. "Mrs. Graves," Jonah said, scrambling to his feet. "I mean, Eleanor. Ma'am, would you like to sit down?" The boy's earnestness was almost painful. Eleanor managed a small smile. "Thank you, Jonah." She sat on the bench across from him. Up close, she could see what he was carving. A bird, maybe a hawk. The details still rough, but recognizable. His hands were steady despite his obvious nervousness. "That's lovely work," Eleanor said, because it was true and because the silence needed filling. Jonah flushed with pleasure. "Uncle Mason taught me. He can carve just about anything. He made all the furniture in here, even the table we're sitting at." Eleanor looked at the table with new appreciation. It was solid work, the joints fitted precisely, the surface worn smooth by use. "That's quite a skill." "Passes the time in winter," Mason said from the kitchen. He was ladling beans into bowls, cutting thick slices from a loaf of cornbread. "Food's ready." They ate together, the three of them crowded around the table. The beans were simple but good, flavored with salt pork and onions. The cornbread was dense and filling. After weeks of near starvation, Eleanor had to force herself not to eat too quickly, not to make herself sick. Jonah filled the silence with chatter, asking Mason about the trip to town, telling him about a fox he'd seen near the chicken coop, about the fence post that needed replacing. Mason listened more than he spoke, asking occasional questions, his attention fully on the boy. Eleanor watched them interact and felt something twist in her chest. The easy affection between them, the way Jonah looked at Mason with such obvious trust and admiration, it reminded her of what she'd lost. Mary would have been 35 now if she'd lived. She might have had children of her own. Eleanor might have been a grandmother. "Eleanor?" She realized Mason had spoken to her. Both he and Jonah were looking at her with concern. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I asked if you wanted more," Mason said, gesturing to her bowl. She'd cleaned it without even realizing. "No, thank you. It was delicious." Mason nodded. He stood and began collecting the dishes. Eleanor immediately rose to help, but he waved her off. "You've had a long couple of days. Jonah and I can handle cleanup." "I can help," Eleanor insisted. I should earn my keep." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Mason paused, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "You're not a servant here, Eleanor. You're a guest." "I'm a woman you paid $50 for," Eleanor said bluntly. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Jonah's eyes went wide. He looked between Eleanor and Mason like he was watching a pot about to boil over. Mason set the dishes down carefully. "Jonah, why don't you go check on the chickens? Make sure that fox didn't come back." "But it's almost dark." "Jonah." The boy recognized the tone. He grabbed his jacket and hurried out, closing the door behind him with perhaps more force than necessary. Mason turned to Eleanor. "I paid that money to keep you out of Pritchard's hands. That's all." "Nothing is ever that simple," Eleanor said. Her hands were shaking again, but she kept them clasped in front of her, trying to still them through force of will. "Men don't do things without expecting something in return. So what is it you want from me? Because I'd rather know now than find out later, when I've let my guard down." Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out the bench and sat down across from her, his movements deliberate and slow, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said finally. "Childbirth. The baby too. A girl." Eleanor's anger deflated slightly. "I'm sorry. Her name was Caroline. The baby was going to be Sarah." Mason's voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the carefully controlled pain beneath it. "I loved her. Caroline, I mean. Loved her more than I knew how to say. And when she died, I wanted to die too." He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "I came up here to get away from people, from memories, from everything. Jonah's mother, My sister, she died 2 years back, influenza. His father had already run off. I'm all the family he's got left." "That doesn't explain why you bought me," Eleanor said, but her voice was gentler now. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Mason met her eyes. "Truth is, I saw you on that platform, and I saw someone who'd given up, someone who figured the world was done with her, and maybe she was done with it too. And I thought—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought maybe both of us deserved better than that." Eleanor wanted to argue, to push back, to maintain the defensive walls she'd built. But something in his face stopped her. He wasn't lying. Whatever his motivations, whatever he hoped to gain, he genuinely believed what he was saying. "I don't know how to do this," Eleanor said quietly. "I don't know how to be here in this place with you. I don't know what you expect." "I don't expect anything," Mason said. "But if you're asking what I hope for, I hope you'll stay long enough to rest, to remember what it's like not to be afraid all the time. And if that's all that happens, that'll be enough." The door opened, and Jonah stuck his head in cautiously. "Chickens are fine. Can I come back in, or are you still arguing?" Despite everything, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. "We're done arguing." "Good, because it's cold out here." Jonah came in and headed straight for the fireplace, holding his hands out to warm them. "Uncle Mason, are you going to teach Eleanor how to shoot tomorrow?" Mason raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think Eleanor wants to learn how to shoot?" "Well, she should know how," Jonah said matter-of-factly. "In case something happens. There's bears up here, and mountain lions, and sometimes wolves. Everybody should know how to protect themselves." Eleanor looked at Mason. "Do you think I should learn?" He shrugged. "Wouldn't hurt, but only if you want to." Eleanor thought about it. She'd never fired a gun in her life. Thomas had owned a rifle, but he'd never taught her to use it. Said it wasn't something a woman needed to know. "I'd like to learn," she said. Jonah grinned. "I'll help. I'm getting pretty good. Uncle Mason says I might be able to start hunting with him next season." "We'll see about that," Mason said, but there was affection in his voice. "For now, it's time for bed. You've got chores in the morning." Jonah groaned but didn't argue. He bid them both good night and climbed the ladder to the loft, his footsteps creaking across the boards overhead. Eleanor stood. "I should go to bed as well. Thank you for supper." "Eleanor," Mason said as she turned to go. She looked back. "You can relax here. I mean that. You don't have to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but trust, once broken as thoroughly as hers had been, didn't rebuild itself overnight. "Good night, Mason," was all she said. In her room, Eleanor undressed down to her shift and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool and clean, the quilt warm. Through the wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of Mason moving around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door, his footsteps heading to what must be his own bedroom. Then silence. Eleanor lay in the darkness and tried to understand what had happened to her. 2 days ago, she'd been preparing for the auction, convinced her life was effectively over. Now she was in a cabin in the mountains with a man who claimed to want nothing from her and a boy who carved wooden birds. It didn't make sense. Life didn't work this way. People didn't rescue you without expecting payment. Kindness always had a price. Except maybe, a small voice whispered in her head. Maybe sometimes it didn't. Eleanor pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd figure out what Mason really wanted. Tomorrow she'd start planning her next move, in case this all fell apart. But tonight, just for tonight, she let herself rest. The first days at the cabin passed in a strange, suspended stillness that Eleanor didn't quite trust. She woke each morning expecting Mason to drop the act, to reveal whatever he really wanted from her. Instead, he just kept being relentlessly, confusingly decent. He showed her where everything was in the kitchen, the flour and sugar in sealed tins to keep out mice, the root cellar where he stored potatoes and carrots and apples, the smokehouse where strips of venison hung drying. He explained his routines without making them sound like orders. The chickens needed feeding twice a day. The vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, needed the last of its weeds pulled. Firewood needed splitting and stacking. "You don't have to do any of it," Mason said each time he showed her something new. "But if you want to help, that's how it's done." Eleanor helped, partly because idleness made her anxious, partly because she needed to feel useful, but mostly because she didn't know what else to do with herself. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs, pulled weeds from the garden, swept the cabin floors. Simple tasks that required no thought, that let her hands stay busy while her mind tried to adjust to this new reality. Jonah shadowed her sometimes, chattering away about everything and nothing. He told her about the animals he'd seen in the woods, about the books Mason had taught him to read from, about his mother and the farm they'd lived on before she died. "Uncle Mason came and got me," Jonah said one afternoon as they gathered the last of the squash from the garden. "Right after Mama passed. He rode 3 days straight to get there. The neighbors were talking about putting me in an orphanage, but he wouldn't let them." "He seems like a good man," Eleanor said carefully. "He's the best man I know," Jonah said with the absolute certainty of youth. "He never yells, not even when I mess up, and he always keeps his promises. If Uncle Mason says something, you can believe it." Eleanor wanted to share the boy's faith, but she'd learned the hard way that even good men could disappoint you, could fail you when you needed them most. On the third morning, true to his word, Mason took her out behind the cabin to teach her to shoot. He started with the basics: how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. His instructions were patient and clear, his hands impersonal when he adjusted her grip or her stance. "Don't be afraid of it," he said when Eleanor flinched at the weight of the gun in her hands. "Respect it, yes, but fear makes you clumsy." Eleanor's first shot went wide, kicking up dirt 6 feet from the target Mason had set up, a piece of wood with a charcoal circle drawn on it. Her second shot was closer. By the 10th, she actually hit the edge of the target. "Not bad," Mason said. "You've got steady hands. That's half the battle." Jonah, watching from the porch, whooped with encouragement. "Try again. You almost had the center that time." They practiced for an hour until Eleanor's shoulder ached from the recoil and her ears rang despite the cotton Mason had given her to stuff in them. When they finished, Mason cleaned the rifle with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. "We'll practice again in a few days," he said. "Once you get the feel for it, it becomes second nature." That night at supper, Jonah regaled them with an enthusiastic and only slightly exaggerated account of Eleanor's shooting lesson. Mason listened with a small smile, occasionally correcting the more dramatic embellishments. Eleanor found herself relaxing despite her best intentions. The cabin felt warm and safe in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The food was simple but plentiful. The conversation was easy. Jonah's laughter filled the spaces that might otherwise have been awkward. It was almost enough to make her forget that none of this was really hers. The following week, Mason announced he needed to ride down to check his trap lines in the lower valley. "I'll be gone most of the day," he said at breakfast. "Jonah, you'll stay and help Eleanor with the chores." Eleanor's hands tightened on her coffee mug. This was it then. The first test. He was leaving her alone, or nearly alone, with just a boy, to see if she'd run, if she'd steal from him, if she'd prove to be the kind of person who couldn't be trusted. "I'll be fine," she said evenly. "There's plenty to keep me busy." Mason nodded and left shortly after, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the morning quiet. Eleanor waited until she was sure he was truly gone, then looked at Jonah. "What would you like to do first?" The boy shrugged. "I usually muck out the shed on Tuesdays. Want to help?" They worked together through the morning, Eleanor gradually realizing that Jonah wasn't watching her with suspicion. He was just a boy doing his chores, happy to have company. By midday, when they stopped for lunch, Eleanor had almost forgotten to be anxious. Almost. "Can I ask you something?" Jonah said around a mouthful of bread and cheese. "Of course. Are you going to stay?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "I don't know. Why?" Jonah looked down at his plate. "Uncle Mason's been different since you came. Happier, I think. He smiles more, and the cabin feels less empty." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm just a guest, Jonah. This isn't permanent." "But it could be, couldn't it?" The boy's gray eyes, so like Mason's, met hers with an intensity that was startling. "If you wanted it to be?" "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "How did you explain to a 13-year-old boy that you'd learned not to trust anything that seemed too good? That you'd been disappointed so many times that hope felt like a luxury you couldn't afford?" "Because life doesn't work that way," Eleanor said finally. "Good things don't just happen to people like me." Maybe they do, Jonah said stubbornly. Maybe you just have to let them. Before Eleanor could respond, they heard a horse approaching. Mason was back, earlier than expected. He came in carrying something wrapped in cloth, fresh meat from a deer he'd found caught in one of his snares. Thought we could have a proper roast for supper, he said, then paused, looking between Eleanor and Jonah. Everything all right? Everything's fine, Eleanor said quickly. We got the shed mucked out and the chickens fed. Mason nodded, but his eyes lingered on her face like he could read the uncertainty there. He didn't press, though. He just set about preparing the venison while Jonah went to gather vegetables from the root cellar. That evening, they ate the roast with potatoes and carrots, and it was the best meal Eleanor had tasted in months, maybe years. As she helped clean up afterward, she caught herself humming an old song Thomas used to sing while he worked. She stopped immediately, startled by her own carelessness. When had she started feeling comfortable enough to hum? I know that song, Mason said quietly from beside her. My mother used to sing it. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She just nodded and kept washing dishes. Later, alone in her room, she examined the dress she'd been wearing at the auction. It was still folded at the bottom of her pack, wrinkled and stained. Looking at it made her feel sick. It represented everything she wanted to forget. On impulse, Eleanor carried it outside. The moon was bright enough to see by, turning the valley silver in shadow. She walked to the edge of the clearing where the forest began and found a spot beneath a tall pine. She dug with her hands, the soil cold and slightly damp. When the hole was deep enough, she laid the dress in it and covered it over, patting the earth smooth. It wasn't a burial exactly, more like a letting go. When she turned to walk back to the cabin, she found Mason standing on the porch, watching her. She froze, caught, waiting for questions she didn't know how to answer. But Mason just nodded once, a gesture of understanding, or maybe permission, and went back inside. Eleanor stood in the moonlight for a moment longer, then followed him in. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm that became almost comfortable. Eleanor learned the patterns of the cabin, the routines that made up their days. She discovered she had a talent for baking, that her bread rose higher and lighter than Mason's ever had. She mended Jonah's torn shirts and patched the holes in Mason's work gloves. She learned which chickens were the best layers and which were just troublemakers. Mason taught her more about shooting, about tracking animals in the woods, about reading weather signs in the sky and the wind. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything more than she chose to give. It was unnerving. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Eleanor was sitting by the fire mending a sock when Jonah asked Mason to tell the story of how he'd built the cabin. You've heard it 100 times, Mason said, but he was smiling. Eleanor hasn't, Jonah pointed out. Mason glanced at Eleanor and she found herself nodding. I'd like to hear it. So Mason told the story. How he'd come to this valley 6 years ago, broken and grieving, and decided to build something with his own hands. How he'd felled the trees and hewn the logs, fitted the stones for the chimney, raised the roof beam by beam. How it had taken him nearly 2 years to finish, working through winters that nearly killed him, through summers when the heat and the black flies made every day a misery. Why didn't you give up? Eleanor asked when he finished. Mason looked at her across the firelight. Because I needed to prove to myself that I could still build something, that I wasn't just broken pieces that couldn't be put back together. The weight of his gaze made Eleanor look away first. She understood what he was saying, understood it in her bones. Because wasn't that what she was trying to do here? Put herself back together, piece by piece? I think I'm going to bed, she said abruptly, setting aside her mending. Good night, Eleanor, both Mason and Jonah said. In her room, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and admitted something to herself that she'd been avoiding for weeks. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay here, in this cabin, with these people who asked nothing of her except that she exist. The realization terrified her, because wanting something meant you could lose it, and Eleanor had lost enough. The first snow came in early November, light flurries that dusted the ground and melted by noon. Jonah was ecstatic, already talking about when there would be enough snow for sledding. Mason just checked their firewood supply and made plans to bring in more before the serious winter set in. Eleanor helped stack wood, her hands growing calloused from the work. She was stronger now than she'd been when she arrived, No longer the hollow-eyed woman from the auction block. She ate 3 meals a day. She slept through the night. Her dresses, which had hung loose when she first came, now fit properly. She was healing, though she tried not to think about it too hard. One afternoon, while Mason and Jonah were out hunting, Eleanor found herself alone in the cabin with nothing immediate to do. She wandered through the rooms, really looking at them for the first time. Mason's bedroom door was ajar. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity pulled her forward. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was sparse: a bed, a dresser, a chair. But on the dresser sat a small oval frame, and in it was a photograph of a woman, young, pretty, with dark hair and a gentle smile. Caroline it had to be. Eleanor picked up the frame carefully, studying the face of the woman Mason had loved. She looked kind, happy, the kind of woman who probably never doubted her place in the world, who never questioned whether she was wanted. That was taken 2 months before she died. Eleanor spun around, nearly dropping the frame. Mason stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quickly, setting the photograph back down. "I shouldn't have. I was just. It's all right." Mason came into the room and picked up the frame himself, looking at it with an expression that made Eleanor's chest ache. "I don't look at it much anymore. Hurts less that way." "Do you still love her?" The question came out before Eleanor could stop it. Mason set the frame down gently. "Yes," he said simply, "but not the way I did. It's different now, like loving a memory instead of a person." He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Dad. "That probably doesn't make much sense." "No, it does," Eleanor said softly. "I still love Thomas. But he's been gone 3 years, and sometimes I can't quite remember what his voice sounded like, and I feel guilty about that." They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd loved and lost, trying to figure out what came next. "I brought back a turkey," Mason said finally. "Thought we could have a proper feast. Jonah's out back plucking it now." Eleanor followed him out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. As they walked back to the kitchen together, she realized something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had crumbled, leaving them just a little bit closer than before. It should have scared her. Instead, it felt like breathing. The turkey feast became something more than just a meal. Eleanor found herself taking charge in the kitchen with a confidence that surprised her. Seasoning the bird with wild sage Mason had dried from the summer, roasting it alongside root vegetables until the whole cabin filled with smells that made Jonah pace like a hungry wolf. When they finally sat down to eat, the boy's eyes went wide. "This is better than anything Mama ever made," he said, then immediately looked stricken. I didn't mean—" "It's all right to say it," Eleanor told him gently. "Good food is good food. That's not being disloyal to your mother's memory." Jonah relaxed, and they ate until they couldn't eat anymore. Afterward, Mason pushed back from the table with a satisfied sigh. "Haven't had a meal like that since—" He stopped, glancing at Eleanor. "Well, since a long time." The almost mention of Caroline hung in the air between them, but it didn't feel painful, just acknowledgement of what had been, what was lost, what might still be possible. That night, Eleanor lay in bed listening to the wind pick up outside, rattling the shutters. The temperature was dropping. Real winter was coming, the kind that would lock them in this valley for months, the kind that would make leaving impossible, even if she wanted to. Did she want to? The question kept her awake longer than the wind did. By morning, 6 inches of fresh snow covered everything, transforming the valley into something from a picture book. Jonah was beside himself with joy, begging Mason to let him go sledding on the hill behind the cabin. "Chores first," Mason said, but he was smiling. "Then we'll see." Eleanor watched them through the window as they worked together, clearing paths to the shed and the chicken coop, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Jonah was talking constantly, his voice carrying on the crisp air, and Mason was actually laughing at something the boy said. She turned away from the window, that familiar tightness in her chest. They were fine without her. They'd been fine before she came. She was the interloper here, the temporary addition that didn't quite fit. "Eleanor?" Mason's voice came from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "You all right?" "Fine," she said automatically. "Just thinking." "About what?" Eleanor almost deflected, almost gave him some pleasant non-answer. But something about the way he asked, genuine curiosity without pressure, made her tell the truth. About whether I belong here. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the fire and added another log, taking his time before he spoke. My father left when I was 8, he said finally. Just up and disappeared one day. Took what money we had and vanished. My mother never talked about it, but I could see what it did to her. Made her afraid to trust anyone, afraid to let people get close. She spent the rest of her life waiting for the next person to leave. Eleanor watched him, understanding where this was going but not wanting to interrupt. When Caroline died, I thought I understood how my mother felt. Thought I'd never trust anyone again either. Never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that. Mason turned to look at her. But that's not living, Eleanor. That's just surviving. And there's a difference. What if I don't know how to do anything else? The words came out smaller than she intended. Then you learn, Mason said simply. Same way you learn to shoot. Same way you're learning everything else up here. One day at a time. Before Eleanor could respond, Jonah burst through the door in a flurry of snow and excitement. Chores are done. Can we go sledding now, please? Mason looked at Eleanor. Want to come with us? She should say no. Should stay here where it was safe and warm, where she didn't risk enjoying herself too much, getting too comfortable. But Jonah was looking at her with such hope, and Mason's expression was so carefully neutral, trying not to pressure her but clearly wanting her to say yes. I don't have proper boots for the snow, Eleanor said. You can wear Caroline's, Mason said, then paused. If you want to. They're in the storage room. Should fit you well enough. The offer felt significant, though Eleanor wasn't sure why. She nodded slowly. All right then. Yes, I'll come. Jonah whooped and ran back outside to prepare the sled. Mason showed Eleanor to the storage room where Caroline's things were packed carefully in a trunk. The boots were there, barely worn, lined with rabbit fur. She only wore them once, Mason said quietly, the winter before we lost her. She was too pregnant to walk far in the snow. Eleanor held the boots carefully, aware she was holding something precious. Are you sure? They're just boots, Eleanor. They should be used. But his voice was tight, and she knew this cost him something. She put them on. They fit almost perfectly. Outside, the world was blindingly bright, sun reflecting off fresh snow. Jonah had dragged an old wooden sled to the top of the hill and was waiting impatiently. Uncle Mason goes first to pack down the path, he explained to Eleanor. Then I go, then we can both go together if you want. Mason took the first run, his long body folded onto the small sled in a way that should have been ridiculous, but somehow wasn't. He flew down the hill, snow spraying up around him, and came to a stop at the bottom with a grace that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. Jonah went next, screaming with delight the whole way down. Your turn, Mason called up to Eleanor. She looked at the sled, then at the hill stretching down below her, and felt something unexpected bubble up in her chest. When was the last time she'd done something purely for joy? When had she last let herself be reckless, even in a small way? She sat on the sled, gripped the rope, and pushed off. The world became speed and cold air, and the sound of her own surprised laughter. She'd forgotten she could make that sound. The sled hit a bump and nearly threw her off, but she held on, and then she was at the bottom, breathless and exhilarated. Again, Jonah shouted, already pulling his sled back up the hill. They sledded for an hour, until Eleanor's hands were numb and her face ached from smiling. Jonah convinced Mason to take him down tandem, the two of them crashing spectacularly into a snowbank at the bottom. Then Jonah insisted Eleanor try it with him. Riding down the hill with the boy's thin arms wrapped around her waist, his laughter in her ear, Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest. Not the painful breaking of loss, but something else. The breaking of ice. The first thaw after a long winter. When they finally trudged back to the cabin, wet and cold and tired, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. That evening, as she made stew for supper and Jonah sat by the fire trying to dry his socks, Mason came to stand beside her at the stove. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For coming with us today. For trying. He paused. I know it's not easy for you, trusting this, trusting us. Eleanor stirred the stew, not looking at him. You make it easier than it should be. Is that a bad thing? She considered the question. I don't know yet. Mason nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. Maybe it was. The days grew shorter and colder. Snow fell regularly now, building up in drifts against the cabin walls. Mason and Jonah brought in load after load of firewood, stacking it on the porch within easy reach. Eleanor filled the root cellar with everything they'd need to last until spring, counting and recounting their supplies with a methodical precision that Mason recognized as anxiety. We'll be fine, he told her one evening as she worried over their flower stores. I've weathered worse winters than this with less. What if the snow gets too deep? What if we can't get to the chickens or something happens to the shed? Then we deal with it, Mason said calmly. But worrying about it now won't prevent it from happening. Eleanor knew he was right, but knowing and feeling were different things. She'd learned the hard way that security was an illusion, that everything you counted on could disappear between one breath and the next. Preparation was the only defense she had. But as December settled in and the snow piled higher, Eleanor found herself relaxing despite herself. The cabin was warm. The food was plentiful. Mason kept the paths clear and the animals fed. Jonah did his chores without complaint and filled the evenings with his endless energy and questions. It was almost like having a family again. The thought scared her so badly she dropped the plate she was washing, sending it crashing to the floor. You all right? Mason asked, looking up from the leather harness he was mending. Fine. Just clumsy. Eleanor bent to pick up the pieces, grateful for an excuse to hide her face. But that night, lying in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Family. The word felt dangerous, weighted with all the ways things could go wrong. Mary had been family, and she'd died. Thomas had been family, and he'd died. Everyone she'd ever loved had left her, one way or another. Letting herself care about Mason and Jonah felt like volunteering for more heartbreak. The next morning, she was quieter than usual. Mason noticed. He always noticed, but he didn't press. Just went about his business, letting her have her silence. It was Jonah who finally broke through her walls. He'd been working on a new carving, something he was being secretive about, and that afternoon he presented it to her with shy pride. It's for you, he said, holding out a small wooden figure. Eleanor took it carefully. It was a woman, her features only roughly defined but clearly meant to be her. The detail work was impressive. The folds of her dress, the way her hair was pulled back, even the slight curve of her shoulders. Jonah, this is beautiful. I wanted to make you something, the boy said, shuffling his feet, to say thank you for staying, for making the cabin feel like a home instead of just a place we live. Eleanor's vision blurred. She blinked hard, trying to clear it. You didn't have to. I know, but I wanted to. Jonah looked up at her with Mason's gray eyes. You make Uncle Mason happy. He doesn't say it, but I can tell. And you make me happy too. I hope you don't leave when spring comes. The simple honesty of it broke something in Eleanor. She pulled the boy into a hug, feeling him stiffen in surprise before relaxing into it. Thank you, she whispered against his hair. This means more than you know. When she let him go, Jonah was grinning. Does that mean you'll stay? I don't know, Eleanor said honestly, but I'm glad I'm here now. It seemed to be enough for him. He ran off to show Mason something he'd found in the woods, leaving Eleanor holding the small carved figure. She took it to her room and placed it carefully on the dresser, where she could see it first thing every morning. That night at supper, Mason was quieter than usual. He kept glancing at Eleanor like he wanted to say something but couldn't quite figure out how. Finally, after they'd finished eating and Jonah had gone to bed, he spoke. I need to tell you something. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Here it was. The moment she'd been waiting for, the revelation of what he really wanted, what he really expected. All right, she said, keeping her voice steady. Mason stood and began pacing, a restless energy to him that was unusual. He was normally so controlled, so calm. When I bought you at that auction, he began, then stopped. No, that's not. When I paid for you. When I did that, I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I couldn't let Pritchard have you, couldn't let them treat you like that. I know, Eleanor said. But the thing is, Mason ran a hand through his hair. The thing is, I've been lying to myself about why. Eleanor's hands tightened on the edge of the table. What do you mean? I told myself it was about my mother, about doing the right thing, about basic human decency. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. But that's not all of it. The truth is, I looked at you on that platform and I saw someone who understood loss, someone who'd been through hell and was still standing, and I thought maybe we could help each other, not because either of us owed the other anything, but because— He broke off, struggling with the words. Because we're both broken, Eleanor finished quietly. No, Mason's voice was firm. Because we're both healing. There's a difference. Eleanor stood, needing to move, needing to think. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered valley, silver in the moonlight. What are you saying, Mason? I'm saying I don't want you to leave when spring comes. The words came out in a rush. I'm saying that having you here has made me remember what it's like to want to come home at the end of the day. What it's like to care about someone who isn't blood family but feels like it anyway. He paused. But I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation or gratitude. I'm asking if you might want to, for yourself. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass. I'm afraid. Of what? Of everything. Of trusting this. Of caring too much and losing everything again. Of being happy and having it ripped away. She turned to face him. Every good thing in my life has ended in loss, Mason. Every single one. Why would this be different? Mason crossed the room until he was standing in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. It might not be, he said honestly. I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen, that you'll never lose anyone again. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that if you stay, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never feel unwanted or unvalued, that you'll always have a place here for as long as you need it. That's not a small thing you're offering, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. I know. And you don't expect anything in return? No wifely duties or— Mason's expression softened. Eleanor, if all I wanted was someone to warm my bed, I could have found that in town for a lot less than $50. What I want is someone to share my life with. A partner. A friend. Someone who understands what it's like to start over after everything falls apart. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him. At the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. At the calluses on his hands from a lifetime of hard work. At the gentle certainty in his face that said he meant every word. I don't know if I can be what you need, she whispered. You already are, Mason said simply. You just have to decide if you want to be. He stepped back, giving her space. Think about it. There's no rush. We've got all winter. Then he left, heading to his own room, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and her fears and the terrifying possibility of hope. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow fall in thick, soft flakes. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. The wind whispered through the pines. The world was vast and cold and indifferent, but inside this cabin was warmth and light and the chance, just the chance, of something better. Eleanor touched the glass, her fingers leaving prints in the condensation. She thought about Mary, buried in a grave she could no longer visit. About Thomas, who'd tried his best but hadn't been enough to save them from ruin. About all the years she'd spent just surviving, never really living. She thought about Jonah's carved figure on her dresser, about Mason's patient teaching and his careful respect for her boundaries, about the way the cabin felt when they were all together, the way laughter sounded after months of silence. She thought about being 55 years old and being given a second chance when she'd thought all her chances were gone. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Mason and Jonah already up, making breakfast. She could hear them talking in the kitchen, Jonah's voice bright with excitement about something. She dressed slowly, taking time with her hair, smoothing her dress. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in months. When she emerged from her room, Mason looked up from the stove. Their eyes met, and Eleanor saw the question there, the hope he was trying not to show too clearly. I'd like to stay, she said, through the winter. And then, we'll see. It wasn't a commitment, it wasn't a promise, but it was a step forward, and from the way Mason's face lit up, it was enough. Good, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's good." Jonah let out a whoop and threw his arms around Eleanor's waist. "I knew you would! I knew it!" Eleanor hugged him back, feeling the tightness in her chest begin to ease. Maybe Mason was right. Maybe this wasn't about promises or guarantees. Maybe it was just about choosing to try, day by day, to build something new from the wreckage of what had been lost. The winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin something was thawing. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself settling into the rhythm of life at the cabin with less resistance. She stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped looking for hidden meanings in every kind word or gesture. Mason was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man who'd been alone too long and was grateful for company. They developed their own routines. Mason would rise first and start the fire, then wake Jonah for morning chores. Eleanor would make coffee and start breakfast. They'd eat together, discussing the day's plans, then split up to handle their various tasks. Evenings were spent by the fire, Mason carving or mending equipment, Jonah reading from one of the few books they owned, Eleanor sewing or knitting. It was simple, peaceful. And slowly, Eleanor stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like she belonged. One evening in late December, Mason announced they should celebrate Christmas. "We don't have much for presents," Jonah said, "but we could at least have a special dinner. Maybe Eleanor could make one of her pies?" "I could make two," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the offer, "if we have enough dried apples." "We do," Mason confirmed, "and I saw turkey tracks near the creek yesterday. Might be able to bring one down." They spent the next few days preparing. Mason hunted and brought back not one, but 2 turkeys. Jonah gathered pine branches to decorate the cabin, making it smell like Christmas. Eleanor baked pies and bread, made preserves from the last of their berries, even attempted cookies with the limited supplies they had. On Christmas Eve, they sat down to a feast that rivaled Thanksgiving. The cabin glowed with candlelight, the windows steaming from the warmth inside. They ate until they were stuffed, then sat by the fire while Jonah told stories he'd learned from his mother. Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in years. At some point, Mason caught her eye across the firelight and smiled, and she felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. Later, after Jonah had gone to bed, she and Mason sat in comfortable silence. The fire crackled. Outside, snow was falling again. "This is nice," Eleanor said quietly. "It is," Mason agreed. "I can't remember the last time I felt—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Content. That's what this is. Contentment." Mason looked at her. "You deserve to feel that way." "So do you." They sat with that for a moment, the acknowledgement that they both deserved peace, deserved happiness, deserved this small pocket of warmth in a cold world. "Eleanor," Mason said eventually, "I want you to know that whatever you decide come spring, I'll understand. If you want to leave, if you want to go back to wherever, I won't hold you here." Eleanor looked at him, at this man who'd saved her without expecting anything in return, who'd given her space to heal, who'd offered her a home when she had nothing. "I know," she said, "and that's exactly why I think I might stay." Mason's breath caught. "Might?" "Might," Eleanor repeated, but she was smiling. "Like you said, one day at a time." It wasn't a declaration of love, it wasn't a promise of forever, but it was honest, and it was real, and it was enough. For both of them. The fire burned low between them, and in the comfortable silence that followed her words, Eleanor realized something had fundamentally shifted, not just in how she felt about this place, but in how she felt about herself. She was no longer the broken woman from the auction block, desperate and hollow-eyed. She was becoming someone else, someone she'd thought was lost forever. Mason stood and added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. When he sat back down, he was closer than before, though still maintaining that careful distance he always kept. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "What do you think about when you look in the mirror now?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She considered lying, deflecting, but she'd promised herself she'd be honest here, even when it was uncomfortable. "I think I look less like a ghost," she said finally. "When I first came here, I could barely recognize myself. I looked haunted, hunted, like something already half dead. She paused. Now I see someone who's lived through hard things and survived them. Someone who's tired, but not defeated. Mason nodded slowly. Good. That's good. Why do you ask? Because I remember what it was like, he said quietly. After Caroline died, I couldn't look at myself for months. Felt like I'd see a murderer looking back. Like I'd killed her by getting her pregnant, by not being able to save her. Eleanor's heart clenched. Mason, that wasn't your fault. I know that now. Took a long time to believe it, though. He looked at her. I guess I wanted to make sure you weren't still blaming yourself for things that were never in your control. Eleanor thought about Thomas's debts, about the choices that had led her to that auction block. Some of it was in my control. I could have been more careful with money. Could have insisted Thomas stop gambling when I first noticed it. Could have, maybe, Mason agreed. But you can't live in the past, Eleanor. Can't spend all your time thinking about what you should have done differently. At some point, you have to forgive yourself and move forward. Is that what you did? I'm trying to, Mason said. Every day I'm trying. They sat with that truth between them, two people learning to forgive themselves for simply being human, for making mistakes, for surviving when others didn't. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brilliant winter day that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Jonah was up early, eager to check the rabbit snares Mason had set earlier in the week. Eleanor watched from the window as the man and boy trudged through the snow together, their tracks making twin lines across the pristine white landscape. She turned from the window and caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging near the door. Mason's question from the night before echoed in her mind. Who did she see now? A woman with color in her cheeks again, gray hair that she'd actually bothered to comb carefully that morning, eyes that, while still marked by loss, held something that might have been hope. She wasn't young, would never be young again, but she was here, present, alive in a way she hadn't been in years. Eleanor touched her reflection, then let her hand drop. She had work to do. She spent the morning baking bread, the familiar rhythm of kneading dough meditative and calming. When Mason and Jonah returned with 3 fat rabbits, she helped prepare them for the stew pot, her knife work efficient and sure. These were skills she'd always had, but had forgotten held value. Here, in this cabin, everything she could do mattered. Eleanor, Jonah said as they worked side by side, can I ask you something? Always. Do you miss your old life? Before everything happened? Eleanor considered the question carefully. The boy deserved an honest answer. I miss my daughter, she said. She died when she was very young, and I'll always miss her. And I miss parts of my marriage. Not all of it, but parts. The companionship. Having someone who knew me. She paused. But do I miss the life I had right before I came here? The debts, and the fear, and the constant worry? No, I don't miss that at all. Jonah nodded thoughtfully. I miss my mama, but I don't miss being scared all the time that we wouldn't have enough to eat or that she'd get sicker. Does that make me bad? Oh, sweetheart, no. Eleanor set down her knife and turned to face him fully. It makes you human. You can love someone and still be relieved that certain kinds of suffering are over. Those things can exist together. Uncle Mason says the same thing, Jonah said, about his wife. He loved her, but he says he's glad she's not in pain anymore, that she's at peace. He feels guilty about being glad, though. Eleanor glanced toward the window, where Mason was splitting more firewood, his breath making clouds in the cold air. We all carry guilt we don't need to carry. It's one of the heaviest burdens there is. Is that why you buried that dress? Jonah asked. To stop carrying something? Eleanor stared at him. You saw that? I was up in the loft that night. Couldn't sleep. I saw you go out and then come back without it. He ducked his head. I wasn't spying. I was worried you were leaving. Eleanor reached out and squeezed his shoulder. I wasn't leaving. I was letting go. Of what? Of the person I was when I wore that dress. The person who'd given up on herself. Eleanor smiled slightly. I needed to bury her so someone new could grow in her place. Jonah grinned. I like the new person. So do I. Eleanor admitted. I'm still getting to know her, but so far she's not so bad. That afternoon, while Jonah was doing his schoolwork, Mason insisted the boy keep up with his reading and arithmetic. Eleanor found herself alone in her room, looking at the small carved figure Jonah had made for her. She picked it up, studying the details he'd captured. The curve of her back, the way she held her hands, the tilt of her head. This was how Jonah saw her, not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone worth capturing in wood, worth preserving. She set the figure down and opened the small trunk where she kept her few belongings. At the bottom, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was her wedding ring. She hadn't worn it since the day the debt collectors had come, afraid they'd take it, afraid of what it represented. Eleanor took it out now and held it up to the light. It was a simple band, scratched and worn from years of wear. Thomas had given it to her when they married, and she'd worn it faithfully for over 30 years. Taking it off had felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that part of her life was truly over. Now looking at it, she felt a strange sense of peace, that life was over. Thomas was gone. The woman she'd been when she wore this ring, young and hopeful and convinced she could make a good life through sheer force of will, that woman was gone too. Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger one last time, feeling its familiar weight. Then she took it off and wrapped it back in the handkerchief. She would keep it, but she wouldn't wear it anymore. It belonged to the past, to a version of herself she'd left behind. When she emerged from her room, Mason was at the table working on a new project, whittling what looked like the beginnings of a chair spindle. Making something? Eleanor asked. Thought I'd build another chair, Mason said without looking up. So we all have proper seats at the table instead of just benches. Eleanor realized what he was saying. He was building furniture for 3 people, planning for her to stay. The thought warmed her more than it should have. That's kind of you, she said. It's practical, Mason replied, but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor sat down across from him and watched him work. His hands moved with confidence and precision, each cut deliberate and sure. She found herself mesmerized by the simple act of creation, of making something useful and beautiful from raw wood. Mason, she said after a while, when did you know you wanted me to stay? Really stay, I mean. He paused in his work, considering. About 2 weeks in, he said finally. You made cornbread one morning, and Jonas said something that made you laugh, really laugh, not that polite sound people make when they're trying to be nice. And I thought, that's what's been missing, laughter that means something. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. That's a small thing to base a decision on. Maybe, but sometimes the small things are what matter most. Mason looked at her directly. I'd spent 6 years in this cabin with nothing but silence and grief for company. Hearing you laugh made me remember what joy sounded like. I'm not always joyful, Eleanor warned. I have bad days. Days when the grief comes back so hard I can barely breathe. I know. I have those days too. Mason set down his knife. But maybe we can help each other through them. Maybe that's what this is really about, not fixing each other or saving each other, but just being there when the bad days come. Eleanor thought about that. It was such a simple thing, really, just not being alone with the darkness, just having someone who understood what it was like to lose everything and still have to keep going. I think I'd like that, she said quietly. Mason smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Good, because I'd like it too. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable pattern. The snow continued to fall, piling up until the drifts reached the windowsills. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the rest of the world, and Eleanor found she didn't mind. The cabin felt safe, insulated not just from the cold, but from all the harshness of the outside world. She and Mason fell into an easy partnership. They cooked together, worked together, sat together in the evenings. The conversations grew deeper, more honest. He told her about growing up poor, about his father's abandonment, about the years he'd spent drifting before he met Caroline. She told him about Mary's death, about the slow erosion of her marriage as Thomas's gambling debts mounted, about the particular humiliation of watching everything you owned being cataloged and sold. Jonah thrived on the attention from both of them. He'd gone from a quiet, cautious boy to someone who laughed easily and talked constantly. Eleanor taught him to bake, and he taught her the names of all the birds that came to the feeder Mason had built. They were becoming, in their own way, a family. One evening in late January, a fierce storm rolled in, the wind howling around the cabin like something alive and angry. Snow battered the windows, and even with the fire roaring, the temperature inside dropped noticeably. "Gonna be a rough night," Mason said, checking the door to make sure it was properly barred. "Jonah, you'll sleep down here tonight. It'll be warmer closer to the fire." They made up a bed for the boy near the hearth, and Eleanor brought extra quilts from the storage room. As she tucked them around Jonah, he looked up at her with trust so complete it made her heart ache. "Will we be okay?" he asked. "We'll be fine," Eleanor assured him. "Your uncle has weathered worse storms than this." "But will you stay with us? Even when it's scary?" Eleanor smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the gesture automatic and maternal. "I'll stay." "Promise?" She hesitated for only a moment. "I promise." Jonah smiled and closed his eyes, reassured. Eleanor stood and found Mason watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to promise him that," Mason said quietly, once Jonah was asleep. "I know, but I meant it." Eleanor met his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Mason. Not anymore." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. This wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. It wasn't about temporary shelter or convenience. This was real. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin, they were safe. Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the wind scream and the walls creak, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was exactly where she needed to be. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow had drifted so high against the north side of the cabin that it nearly reached the roof. Trees sagged under the weight of fresh powder. Everything was buried, pristine, new. Mason went out to dig a path to the animals, and Eleanor helped Jonah with his morning lessons. They were reading together from a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe when Mason came back in, stamping snow from his boots. "Lost 3 chickens," he said grimly. "The cold got into the coop despite the extra straw." Eleanor saw Jonah's face fall. The boy had named all the chickens and considered them his personal responsibility. "I'm sorry," she said to both of them. Mason shrugged, but she could see he was troubled. "It happens. We've still got enough to get through to spring, but we'll need to be more careful with eggs now." That night, Eleanor adjusted their meal plans to accommodate the loss. She made a hearty stew stretch further, made bread last an extra day, found ways to conserve without making it feel like deprivation. These were skills she'd learned during the lean years with Thomas, skills she'd hoped never to need again. But there was a difference this time. She wasn't scrambling alone, trying to hide the extent of their poverty from neighbors who would judge. She was working alongside Mason, both of them committed to getting through this together. "You're good at this," Mason observed one evening as Eleanor portioned out their remaining supplies. "Managing resources, I mean." "I've had practice," Eleanor said dryly. "Well, it's a valuable skill, especially up here." He paused. "Eleanor, I want you to know, if things get tight, if we start running low on something, you can tell me. You don't have to bear that worry alone." Eleanor looked at him, at this man who'd somehow seen past every wall she'd built and chosen to care anyway. "Thank you." "Partners share the burdens," Mason said simply. "That's how it works." Partners. The word lodged itself in Eleanor's chest, warm and solid. February brought a brief thaw, the temperature rising just enough to turn the top layer of snow to slush. Mason used the opportunity to check his trap lines, bringing back rabbit and even a beaver. Eleanor helped him process the pelts, learning the careful work of scraping and stretching. "These will bring good money when I can get to town," Mason explained, "and the beaver tail makes fine eating if you prepare it right." Eleanor watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way nothing was wasted. He lived carefully, consciously, making the most of everything the land provided. "Did Caroline live up here with you?" Eleanor asked, the question surprising her as much as it must have surprised him. Mason paused, then continued his work. "No, she died before I built this place. We had a small house closer to town. Afterward, I sold it. Couldn't stand being there without her." "And you came here?" And I came here. Mason looked out the window at the snow-covered valley. Built this cabin with my own hands, every log, every stone. Thought if I worked hard enough, pushed myself far enough, the grief would go away. Did it? No, but it got bearable. And then Jonah came, and I had to pull myself together because he needed me. And then you came, and I realized— He stopped, shook his head. I realized I'd been surviving but not living. There's a difference. Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. She'd been doing the same thing for 3 years, just going through the motions of existence without really engaging with life. I'm glad you're living again, she said. Mason looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes made her breath catch. So am I. That night, Eleanor took out the dress she'd planned to bury, the one she'd worn to the auction. She'd kept it, despite her intention to let it go, and now she understood why. She needed to see it one more time, needed to face what it represented. The fabric was cheap, the stitching poor. It had been the best she could manage at the time, cobbled together from scraps and desperation. Looking at it now, she felt a distant pity for the woman who'd worn it, who'd stood on that platform convinced her life was over. That woman had been wrong. Eleanor folded the dress carefully and wrapped it in brown paper. In the spring, when the ground thawed, she would bury it properly. Not in anger or shame, but in acknowledgement. A ritual of transition, of letting one life end so another could truly begin. She placed the package at the bottom of her trunk and closed the lid. When she emerged from her room, Mason and Jonah were playing chess by the firelight, the boy studying the board with intense concentration. Want to play the winner? Jonah asked without looking up. I don't know how to play chess, Eleanor admitted. We'll teach you, Mason said. It's a good game for long winter nights. So Eleanor sat and learned, and if she was terrible at it, which she was, it didn't matter. What mattered was the laughter when she made absurd moves, the patient way Mason explained strategy, the joy on Jonah's face when he finally beat her. What mattered was that she was here, part of this, choosing to engage with life instead of just enduring it. Later, after Jonah had gone to bed, Eleanor and Mason sat together in the quiet. Thank you, Eleanor said. For what? For seeing me when I was invisible, for giving me a reason to remember who I am. She paused. For letting me be part of this. Mason reached out and took her hand, the gesture simple and profound. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. You're not part of this, Eleanor, he said gently. You are this. You, me, Jonah. We're a whole now. Do you understand? Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, at the way they fit together despite the differences in size and shape. She thought about all the hands she'd held in her life. Mary's small fingers, Thomas's rough grip, the cold hands of her mother at her deathbed. This was different. This was chosen. I understand, she whispered. They sat like that until the fire burned low, neither of them speaking, neither of them needing to. Outside, the winter night was cold and dark and endless. Inside, they had everything they needed. The snow began to recede in early March, slowly at first, then faster as the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Water dripped from the eaves in a constant rhythm, and the paths around the cabin turned to mud that sucked at their boots. The chickens ventured farther from their coop, pecking at patches of exposed ground with frantic enthusiasm. Eleanor stood on the porch one morning, watching spring wage its slow war against winter, and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Anticipation, maybe. The sense that something was beginning rather than ending. First robin I saw this morning, Mason said, coming up beside her. Won't be long now before everything starts blooming. Eleanor glanced at him. He'd been different these past few weeks, more talkative, more present. The careful distance he'd maintained between them had narrowed to almost nothing, though he still hadn't crossed that final line. Still waiting for her to decide, she realized. Still giving her the choice. Mason, she said, turning to face him fully, when the snow clears enough for travel, what happens? He met her eyes without flinching. That depends on what you want to happen. I told you I'd stay through winter. Winter's almost over. It is. Mason's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. So I guess the question is, do you want to go? Eleanor looked out at the valley, at the cabin they'd shared for 5 months now, at the life they'd built together without ever naming what it was. Did she want to go? Back to what? She had nothing waiting for her in redemption except memories of humiliation. No family, no friends, no prospects. But that wasn't the real question, was it? The real question was whether she was brave enough to choose what she wanted instead of just accepting what she could get. I don't want to go, Eleanor said quietly. But I need to understand what staying means, what you want it to mean. Mason was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came carefully, like he'd been rehearsing them. I want a partner, Eleanor. Someone to build a life with. I want to wake up knowing I'm not alone. Want to come in from working and find you here. I want... He stopped, took a breath. I want what we already have, but I want it to be permanent. I want you to stay because you choose to, because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go. And if I stay, Eleanor said, her heart pounding, what would you expect from me? Honestly? Nothing that you don't want to give. Mason turned to face her fully. I'm not asking you to be Caroline. I'm not asking you to replace anyone or be anything except yourself. If you want to share my bed, I'd welcome that. If you don't, that's fine too. If you want to call yourself my wife, we can make it legal. If you'd rather just be my partner, that works just as well. Eleanor stared at him. You'd really be satisfied with that? Just companionship? Eleanor, I've been alone for 6 years. I've had time to think about what I need, and what I need is someone who chooses to be here. Someone who understands loss and survival and the work it takes to keep going. His gray eyes were intense. You already give me that. Everything else is just details. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever offered her something like this. A relationship built on mutual respect and choice rather than obligation and expectation. Thomas had been a good man, but their marriage had been transactional from the start. She'd brought a small dowry. He'd provided security. They'd cared for each other, but it had been the caring of people fulfilling their designated roles. This was different. This was Mason looking at a 55-year-old widow with gray hair and worn hands and saying she was enough exactly as she was. I want to stay, Eleanor said, and the tears spilled over. I want to stay and be your partner and help raise Jonah and build a life here. I want all of it, Mason. But I'm scared. Of what? His voice was so gentle it nearly broke her. Of being happy. Of letting myself believe this is real. Of trusting that you won't... She couldn't finish the sentence. Won't leave? Won't change my mind? Won't realize you're not worth the trouble? Mason reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Eleanor, I've known what you're worth since the moment I saw you refusing to cry on that auction platform. You're strong and capable and stubborn as hell, and you deserve someone who sees that. I see it. I've always seen it. Eleanor let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I'm not strong. I'm just trying not to break again. That's what strength is, Mason said firmly. It's not about never breaking. It's about breaking and still getting back up. He pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and letting herself cry. Not from sadness, but from relief, from the overwhelming weight of being seen, being valued, being chosen. Mason held her until the tears stopped, his hand moving in slow circles on her back. When she finally pulled away, he handed her his handkerchief without comment. Stay, he said simply. Please stay. Eleanor wiped her eyes and looked up at this man who'd saved her twice, once from Pritchard and once from herself. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll stay. The smile that broke across Mason's face was like sunrise. He pulled her close again and kissed her forehead, chaste and gentle. Thank you. For what? For giving me another chance at this, at having a family, a home that's more than just walls and a roof, at living instead of just surviving. Eleanor wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight. Thank you for giving me the same. They stood like that until Jonah's voice called from inside, Are you two going to stand out there all day? I'm hungry. And they broke apart, laughing. He's got excellent timing, Mason said wryly. He's 13. I'm surprised he noticed we were gone at all. They went inside together, and over breakfast, Eleanor watched Jonah chatter about the spring planting, about the fishing he wanted to do when the creek thawed completely, about whether they could get a dog. She watched Mason listen with patient attention, occasionally interjecting practical considerations. She watched the easy affection between them, the way they moved around each other with unconscious coordination. And she realized this was already her family, had been for months. She'd just been too afraid to acknowledge it. "Jonah," she said during a pause in his monologue, "how would you feel if I stayed permanently, if I became part of this family for real?" The boy's eyes went wide. "Do you mean it? You're really staying? If that's all right with you." Jonah launched himself at her, nearly knocking over his chair in his enthusiasm. "Of course it's all right. I've been hoping you would. Uncle Mason has too, even though he tried to hide it." "I wasn't hiding anything," Mason protested, but he was grinning. "You were terrible at hiding it," Jonah corrected. "You got all weird and quiet whenever Eleanor talked about spring coming, and you started building that extra chair even though you said you were just planning ahead." Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Well, I'm glad everyone's in agreement then." The days that followed felt different, though nothing had technically changed. Eleanor still did the same chores, still cooked and cleaned and helped with the animals. But now there was an acknowledged permanence to it. She wasn't a guest or a temporary fixture. She was home. Mason seemed lighter too, more willing to show affection. He'd touch her hand as he passed, or rest his hand on the small of her back when they worked side by side. Small gestures, but they spoke volumes. They were learning each other, Eleanor realized. Learning what this new relationship looked like, how to navigate the space between friendship and something deeper. One evening, about a week after their conversation on the porch, Eleanor found the wrapped dress at the bottom of her trunk. The ground had thawed enough now. It was time. She carried it outside as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink. Mason was mending fence near the chicken coop. He looked up as she approached. "Need help with something?" "I need to bury this," Eleanor said, holding up the package. "The dress from the auction. I was going to do it alone, but I think I'd like you there. If you don't mind." Mason set down his tools immediately. "Of course." They walked to the edge of the clearing, to the same spot where Eleanor had buried it that first time in a moment of desperate impulse. Together, they dug a proper hole, taking turns with the shovel. When it was deep enough, Eleanor unwrapped the dress one last time. It looked even shabbier now, stained and wrinkled. She remembered the terror she'd felt wearing it, the absolute certainty that her life was over. Standing here now, in this place, with this man beside her, that terror seemed to belong to someone else entirely. "Do you want to say anything?" Mason asked gently. Eleanor thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I think I've said everything I need to say. This is just letting go. Finally, letting go." She placed the dress in the hole, and together they covered it with earth. Mason tamped the soil down firmly, and Eleanor placed a smooth stone on top as a marker. "There," she said. "That part of my life is buried now, for good." Mason took her hand. "What comes next?" Eleanor looked at him, at the cabin behind him, at the valley spreading out in the fading light. "Whatever we choose to make of it." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and when they reached the porch, Mason stopped. "Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know there's no wrong answer." "All right." "Would you want to make this legal? Get married properly, I mean. We could ride down to Redemption once the road's clear, find a preacher." He paused. "But if you'd rather not, if you'd rather keep things the way they are, that's fine too. I just thought I should ask." Eleanor considered the question seriously. Marriage had meant certain things in her first one: legal ownership, societal expectations, defined roles. But with Mason, it could mean something different, a choice freely made, a partnership of equals. "I'd like that," she said. "Not because I think we need a piece of paper to make this real, but because I want to choose you in front of witnesses. I want to stand up and say that this is what I want, who I want. Does that make sense?" Mason's smile was radiant. "Perfect sense." "But not yet," Eleanor added. "Let's wait until summer. Give ourselves time to be sure." "We have all the time in the world," Mason agreed. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eleanor found herself studying her hands. They were rough now, calloused from work, with soil permanently embedded under her nails. They were the hands of a woman who labored, who contributed, who built things. They were nothing like the soft, nervous hands of the woman on the auction block. "You're smiling," Mason observed. "What are you thinking about?" "How different everything is," Eleanor said. 5 months ago, I was convinced my life was over, that I was used up and worthless. And now? Now I know I was wrong. Eleanor looked at him. I wasn't at the end of my life. I was at the beginning of a new chapter. I just couldn't see it yet. Jonah, who'd been pretending to read while obviously listening, spoke up. "I'm glad you couldn't see it. Otherwise you might not have come with Uncle Mason, and then where would we be?" "Probably eating his terrible cornbread," Eleanor teased, and Mason threw a wood shaving at her. "My cornbread was adequate. It was like eating rocks," Jonah said with the brutal honesty of youth. "Traitor, Mason said, but he was laughing. Eleanor watched them tease each other and felt a swell of emotion so strong it almost hurt. This was joy. This was what it felt like to be happy, to be home, to be exactly where you belonged. The next few weeks passed in a blur of spring activity. They planted the garden together, turning over the soil and putting in seeds for vegetables that wouldn't be ready until summer. Mason taught Eleanor and Jonah how to start seedlings in the cabin, tiny plants that would eventually be transplanted outside. The chickens started laying more regularly, and Mason talked about getting a dairy cow when he sold his winter pelts. Eleanor found herself planning for the future with an enthusiasm that surprised her. She wanted to expand the garden, try growing different vegetables. She wanted to make preserves and pickles to last through next winter. She wanted to teach Jonah how to make a proper pie crust, how to mend clothes so the stitches didn't show. She wanted all the small, ordinary things that made up a life. One afternoon in late April, a rider approached the cabin. Eleanor's first instinct was fear. What if it was someone from Redemption, come to drag her back? What if Pritchard had decided to make trouble? But Mason greeted the man warmly, and she realized this was a neighbor from farther up the valley, someone who lived too far away for regular visits, but who checked in a few times a year. "Mason, good to see you made it through winter." The man was older, grizzled, with a friendly smile. "And who's this?" "This is Eleanor," Mason said, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "My partner, Eleanor. This is Samuel Hawkins. His place is about 10 miles north." Partner. The word warmed Eleanor from the inside out. Samuel tipped his hat. "Pleasure, ma'am. Always good to see Mason's got company. Gets too quiet up here for a man alone." They invited Samuel in for coffee, and Eleanor listened as he and Mason talked about the winter, about game sightings, about which trails were passable now. It was the first time she'd seen Mason interact with someone from outside their small circle, and she was struck by how well-respected he clearly was. Samuel spoke to him as an equal, someone whose opinion mattered. Before Samuel left, he turned to Eleanor. "You planning to stick around, ma'am?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I am." "Good. Mason deserves someone to share all this with. And if you need anything, any woman things that these two can't help with, my wife Mary lives up at our place. She'd be happy for the company." The casual acceptance, the assumption that Eleanor belonged here, made her throat tight. "Thank you. I'd like that." After Samuel rode off, Mason pulled Eleanor close. "You handled that well." "Was I being tested?" "Maybe a little. Samuel's a good judge of character. If he didn't think you fit here, he'd have found a way to say so." "And if he had?" Mason kissed her temple. "Wouldn't have mattered. You're here because I want you here, not because anyone else approves." That night, lying in her bed, Eleanor thought about how much her world had expanded. It wasn't just Mason and Jonah anymore. There were neighbors, a community, a place in the larger fabric of life in this valley. She was building something real, something that would last. May brought wildflowers and warmer temperatures. The valley transformed into something out of a painting, every hillside covered in blooms. Jonah dragged Eleanor and Mason out to show them the flowers, pointing out different varieties with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd spent long winter months cooped up inside. "These are columbine," he said, pointing to delicate purple and white flowers. "And these are lupine, And those over there are Indian paintbrush." "How do you know all this?" Eleanor asked, impressed. "Uncle Mason taught me. He knows all the plants, which ones are good to eat, and which ones are poison, and which ones are just pretty." Mason shrugged when Eleanor looked at him. "My mother knew plants. She taught me before she died." Seemed worth passing on. They spent the afternoon in the meadow, Jonah picking flowers and weaving them into crowns the way his mother had taught him. He made one for Eleanor, placing it on her head with solemn ceremony. "Now you're the queen of the valley," he pronounced. Eleanor touched the crown of flowers, feeling absurdly touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jonah." Mason was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Jonah ran off to explore a nearby stream, he moved closer. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Eleanor felt herself flush. "I'm 55 years old with gray hair and wrinkles." "You're beautiful," Mason repeated. "Not despite those things, but because of them. Because of everything you've survived, everything you've overcome. Because you're here, choosing this, choosing us." Eleanor reached up and touched his face, feeling the rasp of his beard under her palm. "How did I get so lucky?" "I think I'm the lucky one," Mason said. Then he leaned down and kissed her, properly this time, and Eleanor felt the last of her reservations melt away. When they pulled apart, Jonah was standing a few yards away, grinning widely. "About time," he said. "I thought you two were going to dance around each other forever." "How long have you been standing there?" Mason demanded. "Long enough." Jonah came over and hugged them both. "Can we go fishing now? I'm hungry." They spent the rest of the afternoon by the stream, catching trout for supper. Eleanor sat on the bank and watched Mason teach Jonah how to tie better knots, how to read the water for where fish might be hiding. The easy companionship between them, the way Mason never talked down to the boy but treated him like a capable person, made her heart full. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, not without struggle or worry, but real and present and chosen. That evening, as they ate the fish they'd caught, Jonah brought up something that had clearly been on his mind. "If you and Eleanor get married," he said to Mason, "does that mean she'll be my aunt? Or should I call her something else?" Mason looked at Eleanor, letting her answer. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," Eleanor said gently. "Aunt or Eleanor or—" She paused, hardly daring to suggest it. "Or you could call me Ma, if you wanted to. I know I'm not your mother and never could be, but if you wanted—" Jonah's eyes filled with tears. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "I'd be honored," Eleanor said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Jonah came around the table and threw his arms around her. "I miss Mama. I'll always miss her. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I get to have a Ma again, even if it's different." Eleanor held him tight, this boy who'd somehow found his way into her heart, and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming fullness of having something she'd thought was lost forever. Not Mary, no one could replace Mary, but the chance to be a mother again, to love a child and be loved in return. Mason watched them with tears in his own eyes, and when Jonah finally pulled away, he cleared his throat roughly. "Well," he said, "I think this calls for something special. I've been saving a bottle for an occasion, and I think this qualifies." He produced a bottle of whiskey from the back of the cupboard, and they each had a small glass, even Jonah, though Eleanor watered his down significantly. They toasted to family, to new beginnings, to the future. "To us," Mason said, raising his glass, "however we define ourselves, whatever we call each other, to choosing to be together." "To us," Eleanor and Jonah echoed. June arrived with longer days and warmer nights. The garden was flourishing, green shoots pushing up through the soil. The chickens were laying well, and Mason's cow, acquired with the proceeds from his pelts, was producing more milk than they could use, allowing Eleanor to make butter and cheese. They fell into new rhythms, new routines. Mason and Jonah worked on expanding the cabin, building a proper addition that would give everyone more space. Eleanor tended the garden and the animals, cooked and cleaned, and discovered she had a talent for cheese-making that delighted everyone. In the evenings, they sat together and planned. Eleanor wanted a proper root cellar, one that would keep vegetables fresh well into winter. Mason wanted to build a small barn for the cow and any future animals. Jonah wanted to clear a space for a proper vegetable garden next year, one big enough to supply neighbors as well. They were building something together, something that would outlast any of them individually. They were creating a legacy. One warm evening in late June, Mason took Eleanor's hand and led her outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what we talked about getting married. And I don't want to wait until late summer. I want to do it now, soon as we can get down to town. I want to stand up in front of witnesses and claim you as mine, and let you claim me right back." Eleanor felt her heart soar. "You're sure?" "Never been more sure of anything." Mason pulled her close. "I love you, Eleanor. I should have said it before, but I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. But I do. I love you, not for what you can do or how you help or any practical reason. I love you for who you are, strong and stubborn and brave and beautiful. I love the way you laugh, the way you've opened your heart to Jonah, the way you've made this cabin into a home. I love all of it, and I want to spend whatever years we've got left, making you happy." Eleanor was crying again, but this time from pure joy. "I love you too. I wasn't sure I could love anyone again after Thomas, but I do. I love you, Mason Hale, and I want to be your wife." Mason kissed her then, long and deep and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor noticed Jonah watching from the cabin window, his face split in a huge grin. "We have an audience," she said, laughing. "Let him watch," Mason said. "Let the whole world see. I'm not hiding how I feel about you." They rode down to Redemption the following week, all three of them on horseback now that Eleanor had learned to ride properly. The town had grown slightly since Eleanor had last seen it, with a few new buildings going up. But it still had that raw, unfinished quality of a place trying to become something more than it was. Eleanor felt eyes on her as they rode through the main street, and she knew people recognized her, the widow who'd been sold at auction. She held her head high, refusing to show shame. She was a different person now, and she didn't owe these people anything. The preacher was a young man, newly arrived, who didn't know Eleanor's history. He agreed to marry them the following day, giving them time to file the necessary papers and arrange for witnesses. That night they stayed at the small boarding house, the same one where Eleanor had waited before the auction. The woman who ran it recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Graves, I thought well, I heard that Mr. Pritchard—" She stopped, clearly uncertain what to say. "Things worked out differently than expected," Eleanor said evenly. "This is my fiancé, Mason Hale, and our son Jonah. We're here to be married tomorrow." The woman's eyes went wide. Oh, how wonderful. I'm so glad to see you well, Mrs. Graves. Truly." Eleanor softened slightly. The woman had been kind to her before, in small ways. "Thank you. We appreciate it." They took 2 rooms, Eleanor in one and Mason and Jonah sharing the other. Eleanor lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the town, so different from the peaceful silence of the valley. Tomorrow she would marry Mason, would legally become his wife. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and nervousness. There was a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find Mason standing in the hallway, looking uncertain. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No, too much thinking." "Me too." He paused. "Eleanor, if you're having doubts, if you want to wait—" "I'm not having doubts," Eleanor interrupted. I'm thinking about how far I've come, how different tomorrow will be from the last time I stood in front of witnesses in this town." Mason understood immediately. "Want to talk about it?" Eleanor nodded and stepped back to let him in. They sat on the edge of the bed, careful to leave the door open for propriety's sake. "The last time I was here," Eleanor said quietly, "I thought my life was over. I thought I was worthless, that no one would ever want me. And now tomorrow I'm marrying a man I love, a man who chose me when he didn't have to, and I can barely believe it's real." "It's real," Mason assured her. "And tomorrow, when you stand up in front of witnesses, I want you to remember something. You're not being sold this time. You're not being claimed or owned or purchased. You're choosing, Eleanor. You're choosing me just as much as I'm choosing you. That makes all the difference." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. How did you get so wise? Hard experience and a lot of mistakes, Mason said wryly. But I'm trying to do this right, trying to give you the kind of marriage you deserve. They sat together in comfortable silence until Mason finally stood. I should go. Let you get some rest. Mason, Eleanor said as he reached the door. Tomorrow is going to be perfect, because we're doing it together, on our terms. That's all I need. He smiled, and Eleanor knew he understood. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Eleanor dressed carefully in her best dress, still simple, still practical, but clean and pressed. She left her gray hair down, held back with a simple ribbon Jonah had given her. When she met Mason and Jonah outside the preacher's small church, Mason's breath caught. You look beautiful, he said. So do you, Eleanor replied, and meant it. He'd cleaned up, trimmed his beard, wore a proper jacket. He looked like a man who understood the importance of the day. The ceremony was small. Samuel Hawkins had ridden in to serve as witness, along with his wife Mary, a stout woman with a warm smile who hugged Eleanor like they were old friends. The preacher's wife and a few curious townspeople filled out the crowd. Eleanor saw Pritchard standing in the back, his expression sour. She met his eyes steadily, refusing to look away. He'd wanted to break her, to own her, to use her up and throw her away. Instead, she was here, choosing her own future, and there was nothing he could do about it. The ceremony was simple. The preacher read from Scripture, talked about love and commitment and partnership. When it came time for vows, Mason took both of Eleanor's hands in his. Eleanor, he said, his voice carrying through the small church, I promise to respect you as an equal partner, to listen to you, to value your opinions and your contributions. I promise to be faithful, to work alongside you in building our life, to be a father to Jonah and any other children who might come into our care. I promise to love you for exactly who you are, without trying to change you or mold you into someone else. I choose you, today and every day forward. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. Mason, I promise to stand with you through whatever comes, to share your burdens as well as your joys. I promise to be honest with you, to trust you with my fears as well as my hopes. I promise to love Jonah as my own son, to help you build a home that's filled with laughter and warmth. I promise to choose you every day for as long as I live. I choose you, Mason Hale. I choose this life, this family, this future. I choose all of it, freely and without reservation. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Mason kissed her, Eleanor felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally heal. Afterwards, Samuel and Mary insisted on hosting a small celebration at the local restaurant. They ate a simple meal, toasted with whiskey, and listened to stories about the valley and the people who lived there. Eleanor found herself laughing, truly laughing, surrounded by people who accepted her without question. When Pritchard walked past their table on his way out, he stopped and sneered. Enjoy it while it lasts, he said to Eleanor. Old women don't stay wanted for long. Before Eleanor could respond, Mason stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He simply looked at Pritchard with cold certainty and said, My wife is worth 10 of you on your best day. Now get out of my sight before I forget I'm in a church town. Pritchard left quickly, and Samuel clapped Mason on the shoulder. About time someone put that jackass in his place. Eleanor reached up and took Mason's hand, pulling him back down to sit beside her. Thank you, she said quietly. Nobody talks about you like that, Mason said fiercely. Not ever again. They rode back to the valley the next day, Eleanor riding beside Mason now instead of behind him. The difference felt significant. They were partners now, equals, making this journey together. When they crested the final ridge and saw the cabin below, Eleanor felt a surge of emotion. This was home. Not just shelter, not just a place to survive, but home. A place she'd chosen, a life she'd built, a future she'd claimed for herself. Jonah whooped and urged his horse forward, racing down the hill. Mason and Eleanor followed more slowly, content to savor the moment. Happy? Mason asked. More than I ever thought possible, Eleanor replied honestly. That first night back, they celebrated quietly. Eleanor made a special dinner, and they ate by candlelight, talking about their plans for the rest of the summer. Jonah wanted to learn to fish better, to help build the barn, to maybe get a dog after all. Mason wanted to clear more land for planting, to build proper furniture for the cabin, to make everything as comfortable as possible before the next winter. Eleanor just wanted more of this, more ordinary days filled with work and laughter, more evenings by the fire, more mornings waking up with purpose and certainty. After dinner, Jonah went to bed without being asked, leaving Mason and Eleanor alone. They stood on the porch together, watching the stars come out. "I should tell you," Mason said quietly, "that I'm nervous about tonight. It's been 6 years since Caroline, and I don't want to disappoint you." Eleanor took his hand. "Mason, we have the rest of our lives. There's no rush, no pressure. Whatever happens tonight, or doesn't happen, is fine. We'll figure it out together." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Thank you." They went inside together, and if their lovemaking was tentative and uncertain, it was also tender and full of genuine care. They learned each other slowly, patiently, without expectation or performance. And afterward, lying in Mason's arms, her husband's arms, Eleanor felt more cherished than she ever had in her first marriage. "I love you," Mason whispered against her hair. "I love you too," Eleanor replied, and finally, let herself believe it was real. The summer passed in a blur of activity and joy. They built the barn together, all three of them working side by side. They expanded the garden until it was producing more than they could eat, allowing them to share with Samuel and Mary and the few other neighbors scattered through the valley. They got a dog, a gangly puppy that Jonah named Scout and trained with surprising patience. Eleanor discovered talents she didn't know she had. She was good at animal husbandry, good at making the most of limited resources, good at creating a home that felt warm and welcoming. More importantly, she discovered she was good at being happy, at accepting joy without waiting for it to be taken away. In August, they held a small gathering at the cabin, inviting their neighbors for a harvest celebration. Eleanor cooked for days, preparing food enough to feed everyone. The party went late into the night, filled with music from Samuel's fiddle and stories from the old-timers who'd been in the valley longest. As Eleanor stood on the porch watching everyone enjoy themselves, Jonah came up beside her. "Ma," he said. He called her that now without hesitation. "Are you happy here? Really happy?" Eleanor put her arm around his shoulders. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." "Good," Jonah said, leaning into her, "because I can't imagine being anywhere else. This is home." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, looking at the cabin, at the valley, at the life they'd built together. "This is home." That night, after everyone had left and Jonah had gone to bed, Eleanor and Mason sat by the dying fire. "Do you ever think about that day?" Mason asked. "At the auction?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "But when I do, I don't think about the fear or the humiliation anymore. I think about how you looked when you knelt down to untie me, how you offered me a choice when everyone else saw me as property, how you saw me when I was invisible." "I saw someone worth saving," Mason said. "No," Eleanor corrected gently. "You saw someone who could save herself, if she was just given the chance. That's what you really gave me, Mason. Not rescue, just a chance." Mason pulled her close. "And look what you did with it." Eleanor looked around the cabin, at the life she'd built, at the family she'd claimed, at the future stretching out before them. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, standing on that platform in Redemption, convinced her story was over. That woman had been wrong. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I chose this," Eleanor said softly. "I chose you. I chose Jonah. I chose this life. Not because I had no other options, but because this is what I wanted, what I want. And that makes all the difference." "It does," Mason agreed. They sat together in the firelight, two people who'd been broken and had found a way to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by choosing to build a different future. Outside, the valley was dark and peaceful. Inside, the cabin was warm and full of love. Eleanor Graves, Eleanor Hale now, was 55 years old, and she'd never been happier. She'd never been more certain of her place in the world. She'd never been more grateful for the unexpected turns that had brought her here, to this cabin, to this man, to this life. She'd been bought for $50 at an auction, treated like property, valued at less than livestock. But she'd reclaimed herself piece by piece, day by day. She'd remembered her worth, not because someone told her she had value, but because she chose to see it in herself. And in the end, that was the real victory. Not being rescued, not being saved, but being given the space and time and respect to save herself. Eleanor smiled and rested her head on Mason's shoulder, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady beat of his heart. This was happiness. This was peace. This was home. And it was hers, freely chosen and hard won. A life reclaimed late, but not too late. Never too late. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and Eleanor couldn't wait to see what came next.